I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. So let's get to it. He's the director of public policy for the Leaders of Beautiful Struggle. Been here many times. Gave me some homework. I did the homework. I am actually ready this morning for this. So let's bring him up here, brother Dayvon Love. Welcome. It's good to see you again. Welcome back.
Hey man, it's good to be on with you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, you sound good. Sounds good.
All right. Cool.
Sounds good. So I don't know exactly where you wanted to start. As we were setting this up, I basically said that the homework, as I was quickly trying to summarize it, was that starting with the most recent ongoing with Campaign Zero, DeRay McKesson and the Blue Vest and that whole crew. And then this piece you sent from, I think, Yale Law School Journal. The Yale Law Journal. So I'll see it. I'll look it back in a second. Pull it up in a second. In fact, the links to all of this are already in the show notes for everybody. I was saying the point became there is a historic precedent for outside white funding and influence, or as the article talks about, movement capture of Black politics that redirects that politics and ultimately leads to the nonsense we're seeing often today. So, but why don't you start with where you wanted us to go and lay out why you wanted to bring this up and all of that, and I'll start pulling up these articles.
Yeah. So you and I have had conversations offline just about a lot of the issues or critiques we have of, the kind of so-called social movement organizations and, just the broader ecosystem of it. And, just after what I find to be just a bunch of more recent conversation about it, I just felt the need to just get on the record, just my thoughts about all of it, because I've been fortunate enough that there are a bunch of people in the kind of so-called movement ecosystem that I know, that I've watched kind of up close and have the experience of, being a part of an organization I co-founded that in many respects has put me in some context at odds with some of those folks. And DeRay to me is just a good example of the difference in the example. So, I mean, really there are two things I want to start with initially. The first is that I actually think sometimes in the conversations about, folks talk about BLM or Movement for Black Lives, I think sometimes people reduce the issues in terms of people being able to get exorbitant amounts of money or platform. I think sometimes that gets attributed to like character flaws, right? People being grifters, which there certainly is some of that. But I actually think the more important conversation is that it's a difference in methodology. That these are folks who are socialized and they really hold true to the belief that America can be better. You know what I mean? And to me, while that sounds really rudimentary, to me, that's like the basis of what I would call the difference in perspective. You know what I'm saying? Where these are folks for whom their thoughts about what it means to do activism work is about, we're going to make America a better place. And for me, I come from the school of thought that America is irredeemably racist. It's fundamentally a white supremacist society. And that if we're interested in actually Black people, being able to experience liberation and practice freedom, we have to build our own autonomous, revolutionary Pan-Africanist movement that isn't reliant on the society treating us better. And I just think there's some people, and there's a book written by Barbara Rainsby called All Black Lives Matter, where she actually documents, some of the different iterations of so-called movement in our current moment. And myself and LBS is included in it. And one of the things that struck me in rereading it a few months ago is in the introduction, she talks about how a lot of the movement for Black Lives, what became movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, many of them were folks who were supportive of Barack Obama's run in 2008 for president and saw it as like hope, for Black people. I remember being in 2008 and being like, why would people who understand white supremacy, imperialism, capital, why would people who understand that think that Obama would be anything other than what he became? Right. And so when I read that, it just made the movement, it made a lot of this ecosystem movement make so much sense, because many of them came from a place where they saw Obama as hope. Now, Ransby writes that she's just, a lot of them are disappointed by the lack of progress in Obama. But to me, the fact that that would even be an option, right? In 08, that was the first time I was old enough to vote in a presidential election. I voted for Cynthia McKinney and Rose Clemente, right? Because I was super clear, right? Two Black women. And I was super clear that that wasn't the case. And then the other thing I want to say, just by way of intro to the topic, is that I just don't think there's enough conversations about money and social movements, like how to sustain social movements. And I think and so sometimes those discussions get had almost separately, as if there's something else. And I'm a believer that the way that you feed yourself, the way that you make your money, is the limit of your politics. And until we have sophisticated conversations about that, then it's going to produce the campaign zeros and all the some of the grifting that we see. Like, all those things are going to happen if we don't have sophisticated conversations about social movements and how they sustain themselves.
All right, first of all, I messed up already because I forgot to remind everybody that and to greet everybody and welcome everybody to
It's Blackfist Fridays.
I mix what I like.
Did that come through clearly? I'm just checking my audio real quick.
Yes, sir.
Did that come through clearly? Okay, so let me welcome everybody again to Blackfist Fridays. And so let me all right, so let me start. If you don't mind, let me start with a little bit of the silliness and work backwards, because there were a couple things in this article that I thought were interesting that because I haven't really followed this that closely, but the article is an interesting recap, into the development and the rise of Campaign Zero. And the main figures in the leadership, starting with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and the coverage of that by this the young sister. I forgot who did what now. Who did what now? Is it LZ that was the one? Is that how you say her name?
Netta. I don't know how you say her last name. I know her Twitter name is Netta.
Netta, right? So she was the one. Okay, because right, I don't think they call her that in this, right?
Yeah, her name is Janetta.
Oh, Janetta LZ, right? I'm sorry, right?
Right.
Netta, right? Sorry about that. So Netta films it, brings in the rest, and somehow I just thought it was interesting that Teach for America, which has its own interesting background. I have forgotten that DeRay was connected to that. Yeah, go ahead.
And can I say something? And so to me, that's a part of when we talk about like people's proximity to institutions and how it gives them access to a platform. Teach for America isn't just a program that brings in teachers. Teach for America also now has gained, and its networks have gained some political salience. So for instance, in Maryland, our Senate president is an alum of Teach for America, right? Mm-hmm. And Teach for America has networks where its goal is to attain political power using kind of this nonprofit network. So in many ways, DeRay isn't random. Mm-hmm. And to go a little bit even further into DeRay, his connection to Teach for America as kind of a white liberal nonprofit container. DeRay comes out of that nonprofit container here in Baltimore. Like, I'm from Baltimore, grew up in Baltimore, and two of the programs he comes out of, Youth as Resources and Safe and Sound campaign, organizations that are run by white folks, organizations that don't train the young people in, social movement activity. LBS actually had a confrontation years ago with the Safe and Sound campaign, the white woman Hathaway Therapy, who runs the organization, who essentially was trying to usurp the fight against a $104 million juvenile detention facility, trying to usurp that the social capital from the Black grassroots organizations, right, that were involved in actually pushing that effort forward. And so we had to criticize her for that. So DeRay, both from Safe and Sound campaign to Teach for America, these are similar liberal nonprofit containers that produce people with this kind of integrationist liberal ideology. And again, many of them had not even been exposed. And in fact, years ago, when we made this criticism, there were Black people who got mad at us, wouldn't talk to us for years, because they were like, oh, these are good white people. They like us and doing stuff for us. And years later, many of them have come back and said, you were right. Right. So I said, to say that like DeRay isn't random. And the Teach for America part is important because it's an entire network from which the nonprofit industrial complex is able to essentially curate the kinds of Black people that get access to this kind of platform.
Okay. Yeah, and please stop me and jump in if there was something in particular that you wanted to bring out from this article. Otherwise, I'm just going through some of the literal highlights that I have from it. But the article is saying here, like, similar stories of movement organizations that have been thrust into the spotlight. This is a tale of how something so promising collapsed because of ego and misguidance. But it is also one that measures the evolution of progressive views and how the ideas behind Campaign Zero got left behind. So the point, long story short, is that there was good intentions. These folks got together, and then more or less they say that DeRay messed it all up. So they started blowing up. They got Oprah Winfrey was praising them, Barack Obama, Jack Dorsey of Twitter, Ariana Grande, all calling them out, saying that they're doing great work. But then tensions started to arise over claim credit and who's doing what. As it says here, even as the conflict between and this was one of the questions. Let me just stop here before I forget. One of the things I wanted to ask you, because I've noticed it, just sort of almost accidentally. So as we've talked a little bit about here already, Patrisse Cullors has come out recently and said with a book that's supposed to be about abolition, or is coming out with one. There's another example that I already forgot. But then here we read again how one of the points that's raised in this article is that DeRay initially did not like, or Campaign Zero did initially not like or agree with the branding or the calls for abolition, and thought it was a deterrent or hampered what their goals were. And then after it blew up and there was the shift in the zeitgeist, now all of a sudden DeRay, is by the end of this article talking about more or less, I'm ready to get on board with abolition. It just seems so shady and opportunist like, but consistent with obviously what this article is intending for its readers to walk away with. But even as the conflict between abolition and reform groups grew, several activist leaders were becoming famous. The co-founders of Black Lives Matter were gracing the covers of magazines. McKesson, Packnett, Cunningham, and Elsie were being named on influential power lists and appearing on television. Other activists such as Tamika Mallory and Sean King were also being signed to speaker bureaus, where they were being paid top dollar. In 2019, a giant photograph of McKesson was hung in the National Portrait Gallery. Speaking of those who make big paydays and spend time in major art centers, Brother Kaba, good morning to you. Good to see you. I don't know if you heard it.
Peace, Brother Kaba.
Good morning.
So can I say something about that, Jared?
Yeah,
That passage.
absolutely. Yep.
So there are a few things. One is, you previously had Dylan Rodriguez on to talk about the way that abolition is being co-opted, right? I think in many ways abolition, his critique of how people have been using it, I think applies both to, Black Lives Matter and to, DeRay, which I feel isn't a close reading of what abolition is supposed to be, which is about, understanding the root of this carceral system, or the society based on carcerality, and the importance of having a trajectory of politics that actually moves in that direction. And I think abolition has become the sexy buzzword. But the thing, one of the things also, you had on Todd Stephen Burrows recently, and where he said that, in his experience, he talked about the difference between an activist and a revolutionary, and understanding that a revolutionary would be an honor to be criticized by the New York Times. And to me, this is one of the problems with the way in which activism is conducted today, because being seen and featured in all these major outlets, one should have the opposite. They should have the opposite effect, right? That these aren't outlets that we should trust to identify who movement leaders are. And so this again goes to show the flaw in the methodology that a lot of people are socialized, by in terms as it relates to doing activist work, right? And so, so to me, that was just almost, and I'm glad you highlighted this piece, because to me, this is the problem. Even as these factions see themselves as different, to me, this is one of the underlying things that in many ways make them more similar than different.
Okay. Anyway, talking about spreading the gospel of wokeness. It was around this time that McKesson decided to run for mayor in Baltimore, which I know you saw up close, Dayvon. LZ questioned his decision to enter the race. It was a disaster, and it lacked the principles that every organizer should know, she says. When I got there, he had too many white people working on his campaign in Baltimore, a very black city. When I would knock on doors, many of the locals didn't know who he was or thought that his campaign was a joke. Even though on the ground canvassing proved to be a bust, DeRay did a lot of outside campaign, did get a lot of outside campaign money, but that was about it. McKesson disputes the idea, says he had black women in all the leadership roles, but he did go on to raise $250,000, but got less than 3% of the vote. LZ goes on to accuse him of erasing her and her work, taking credit for what she had been doing, as did their other colleague who did a lot of the digital programming. He was, this is talking about, now this is actually something I can say I witnessed up close myself. That is in not in this way, but the point being made here is that when McKesson went on to promote his autobiography, and I love, and especially the older I get, I have to say, I know I sound like that old man, but I love how all these young people who've been around for 5 minutes are writing memoirs and autobiographies. It's like, damn, anyway, but he was promoting this in 2019. But he was heckled during a book tour stop in St. Louis by a local black activist who accused him of exaggerating the role he played in the city during the protest. This is a lie. This is not the truth, DeRay. The protester yelled, "You ain't no part of us. Stop using us. You've made money off of us constantly." Now, I can say the point I was making is that before this in 2015 or whatever, when I was working with The Real News and we were covering some of the Freddie Gray uprising, I went downtown one day to cover some protest, and I'm standing there, and the police were out there, blocking traffic and being police and whatever, but they weren't, overly, they were just being regular. I mean, they were just doing their regular job. They weren't even in this case overly. White people. They weren't even, they weren't even doing that. But a crowd had gathered, and at one point there was some sort of commotion, and you know, you could feel the energy going towards this commotion, and I'm standing there in relative calm and safety, and to my left is DeRay. And all of a sudden, he turns to his colleague, somebody he was with, hands his phone to the dude, runs himself into the crowd, like throws himself into the crowd. And then all of a sudden, his colleague, and I'm standing there like this is surreal, like this, and his colleague starts yelling, "They got DeRay! They got DeRay!" And then it's like, and I'm standing there like, "Are you serious?" And then he comes out and comes back, walking towards the dude and says, no, it's all good. I'm okay. Don't worry. It's okay. I'm okay. And I'm sitting there like, of course you're okay, because nothing's happening. And you threw yourself into the nothing. And now you're coming back and creating a little news story about how you survived the conflict in these streets or whatever. And I was like, wow, this is how this works. And so anyway, so when I see, you know, so there have to have been many more examples of that other people were witness to and had greater experience with, as apparently was the case with people calling him out in St. Louis. So anyway,
so
yeah, go ahead.
So Dayvon, I don't know if you heard that, but I heard Dr. Jared Ball say that DeRay is to his left. Is that what he said?
I think I heard that too. I think
I think that's what I heard from that whole thing. That's what I deduced from the whole conversation, from the whole episode. I just want the record to reflect that Dr. Ball just said that.
Yeah, clip that and put this in these YouTube streets. That's funny. That's hilarious. Anyway, so as they go on, I don't know, DeRay, did you want to add or respond to any of that? Otherwise, you know, I'll just pull out a few more of these highlights, you know. No, go ahead.
So two things. One, like you said, I was there, and I've actually had one-on-one conversations with DeRay about a lot of this. And you know, what's interesting to me, so the part about him running for mayor, most people did think it was ridiculous. And I think part of the issue is with DeRay and others like him like to do is to like make themselves victims. Like, you know, people don't like me or people are hating on me because I'm famous or whatever. And the thing that makes Baltimore, you know, unique as a city, and I'm sure other cities may have versions of this, you know, Baltimore people like people who've been around. Like they like people who they've seen outside the context of whatever it is they're known for. You know, they like, you know, so have they seen you in the grocery store? Have they seen you at, you know, community events? Have they seen you at the community cleanup? Right? You know, like, have they seen you around? And DeRay had not been around, did not have a base, particularly a Black base in Baltimore. And to Netta's point, you know, I went to an event that he held in Baltimore at what was then the Living Well on Charles Street, just to check it out, you know, because I'm open to being wrong, right? And I showed up, and the Living Well, which is a space that was owned by Black women, controlled by Black women, when I went in, it was probably 85% white people in the room. You know what I mean? And so, you know, it's one of those things that told me everything I needed to know, you know, about who his base is and continues to be. And you know, in my conversations with him and my conversations about that, you know, he can be tricky. And one of the things that he would say to me in response to that is he would describe this argument that I'm making now as an attempt at like a Black authenticity test, right? And to me, and so I had to sit there, I said, I see what you're trying to do, right? And some people, that may be their approach to this, but I was saying my point to him is about who you're accountable to. So I'm not trying to measure your Blackness, right? I'm trying to understand who are the people from whom you deliver results to and therefore lift you up as a person that represents their interests. And again, I'm fortunate, you know, here in Baltimore and increasingly around the state of Maryland, particularly in our legislative work, they're like actual people I'm accountable to. You know what I'm saying? They're actual Black people for whom we've been able to deliver concrete material results to. And as a result of that, that's how we get, you know, lifted up in the way that we do. So I just think that's an important piece, just in a broader conversation about movement work, because I just don't think I think again for me, it's simple. Who is benefiting from what you're doing, right? And for LBS, that's been a singular focus of ours. Because if Black people are benefiting from the work that we're doing, right, then that justifies us being in spaces and representing positions that advance the quality of life for Black people. And I would argue folks like DeRay and others in the larger movement don't hold themselves to that standard. They don't hold themselves to the standard of what is the evidence in the community of the impact of the work that they've done, right? Because the answer to that question is very little.
So let me just share one more piece from this article that I thought was fascinating towards the end, and then because I do want to get to this other piece that is much more substantive and fascinating. That I think you wanted me and us to see as an antecedent to all of this, as laying down the history to all of this.
Mm.
But this I thought was very interesting towards the end of the article. And forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce this person's name. Sinyangwe said, who was one of the programmers and key part of the leadership of Campaign Zero, said that despite our best efforts to seek compromise and agreement over the organizational strategy, it became clear that DeRay preferred to continue operating without regard for the vision or expertise of the other co-founders or regard for the work being done by others in the movement. LZ agrees. In retrospect, I do not believe that all four of the co-founders were supposed to make it to the end with this organization that we created, she says. I thought that was an interesting statement. I was working with a person who was interested in advancing Black liberation and himself at the same time, which isn't a bad thing, but does become problematic when you begin to prioritize the self, over the people. Now, this was my favorite part, though. Today, Packnett Cunningham is pursuing media career as an MSNBC contributor and podcast host.
but you know what, Jay?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know what? And see, this is the thing. I don't think folks like that get why that's funny. I think that's part of the challenge. Like folks like that don't get why that's funny.
That might be. That's probably an example, though, Dayvon, of the hate that my man was trying to project onto you. It's really
Right.
the other people who are like him trying to get in that lane, and because he's actually advancing farther than they are, then he's interpreting that as hate, which it is in that particular instance, as strange as it is. And he has maybe even in his own mind convinced himself that anybody who criticizes him is doing the same thing that this person just did.
Right.
It might just be that
He's full of shit.
that part too.
but I mean, I don't know, because I think part of the problem that I see being laid out here is just as they are criticizing someone from becoming too focused on the self and self-promotion, they see getting into one of the most self-promotional and politically empty spaces is progress, and a logical conclusion to the work that they're doing. And so that's why, so if we can, I put the link in the show notes already, because people, I think this article should be read more than the one time I've read it, and should probably be talked about a lot more. And if I could just start with the silliness, my favorite part, if I understood what I was reading, is that this is a Black woman checking a white liberal man, right? These are two scholars going back and forth on this history, and it's a sister trying to be as polite and professional as she can, saying to this white liberal dude who self-identifies as a white liberal, my man, you don't understand how to read the history and what Black people are saying to one another. So let me just share at least the title, and then I'll let you start off with whatever you would want. I mean, I'll share, the thing here so people can see what we're talking about. And then if you would like, you can get us started talking about this article that I think is fascinating. Movement Capture or Movement Strategy, a Critical Race History Exchange on the Beginnings of Brown versus Board. Megan Ming Francis and John Fabian Witt are the two discussants. I don't know anything about any of them other than what was said here, and but it's fascinating. So anyway, Dayvon,
Yeah.
Right.
So a part of why I wanted to include this in conjunction with the DeRay piece and Black Lives Matter piece is because I think this notion of movement capture is an interesting and important concept. And I say that because, as again, you and I have talked about offline, there isn't enough conversation about the relationship between money and activism, and that has a history that goes back, in terms of social movements, even back into the mid 19th century, when Martin Delany criticizes the Liberator, which was one of the official organs of the abolitionist movement, that it only had 3 Black people hired at any of the offices nationally on the work of abolition. And his argument is either you don't think Black people are capable, or you don't actually believe in Black people being equal. So I think or human beings. And so I think so for me, understanding that legacy is important to putting in perspective the kinds of movements that exist today. And so for me, again, in terms of conversations about the DeRays, of Black Lives Matter, Move for Black Lives, I think the conversation about those, sets the political history that is necessary to really be able to understand the political consequences and dynamics of what happens when people see movements as proximity to white resources as opposed to like base building and whatnot. And one of the things that I'm critical of in terms of Megan Ming Francis's work, because there's another piece where she actually, lays out the movement capture argument. And she talks about how the NAACP shifted its focus to education away from things like anti-lynching because of money that it was getting from the Garland Fund. The thing that she doesn't mention is the fact that one of the places where the NAACP and the UNIA collaborated briefly was on anti-lynching legislation. And that a part of why the UNIA walked away from that collaboration was because the NAACP and some of the other, kind of more liberal Black organizations, they were willing to compromise on legislation for it to be more symbolic than to actually have federal statute that would, make it a federal crime to engage in lynching. And so the omission of Garvey from her analysis, at least, in the other piece, I think is something that, it's important to talk about. So I'll stop there before I get too much.
No, that's interesting, and like I said, I'm not familiar with her work beyond this, so I there's a lot I would need to catch up to, but this was so essentially, and then we can. I'll just keep it as simple as I think I can make it. But essentially, the argument was, or the difference between what the two are saying is that the Garland Fund, this white philanthropic group that's supposed to be helping with oppressed communities, in the 19th century, right? That's where we are, right?
20th
century. Sorry,
early.
Right, early 20th century. They are the argument between these two scholars is that the Garland Fund either from their directive and initiative offered more funding to the NAACP to move them away from issues of racial violence and into education, or which is what the sister is saying. That's more like what she's saying. The white dude is saying no, and in fact, he actually accuses her of not giving Black people enough agency by saying, they actually were the agents of this and sought out the Garland Fund money because they wanted to move in that direction on their own. That is away from racial violence. That his argument, if you read the documents, they are on their own volition, moving away from concerns over lynching, anti-lynching campaigns, racial violence, etc., and wanting to move into education, and therefore sought out the relationship with the Garland Fund as a natural offshoot or extension of that shift in interest. Part of my response was it almost doesn't matter which side is right or wrong. It's because it's the fact of them feeling a need to get white funding, period, whether they are the agents of it or whether they are being moved by agents the point for me was the initial context of an organization feeling like they need white money to move forward with whatever it is they want to do. And I feel like that point doesn't really get addressed in this particular exchange, which was one thing I thought was interesting. But anyway, but I had never heard of this history. I have never heard of any of these arguments, admittedly. So I was very much, just sort of interested in that whole piece being debated. And I did like the way this was done. I admit I like the scholarly way that they did this. It's like well-written emails with footnotes. But anyway, do you think that I summarized that well? And is there and what else would you want to draw from that? Or were there any other particular points that you wanted to draw from that in making the comparison to today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the guy who describes himself as a white liberal, I think one of the things that often gets missing, is a question of historiography, like what kinds of histories get elevated. So you think about attempts at trying to steer Black social movements, a big part of why NAACP, continues to exist is because of its proximity to power and those resources and the attempt, both politically and historiographically, to omit, right, to frame out other kinds of politics that were wildly popular amongst Black people at the time. And so even like Brown versus Board of Education, the way that it get the historiography of that, where when you look at some of the, again, late 19th century, early 20th century efforts on Black people around issues of education, it wasn't about integration. It was about equitable access to resources in order to help build up the Black educational institutions and other institutions, that they had to build themselves. And so, for me, that's one of those things, again, in talking about the importance of, independent Black institutions, right, that in many respects, have a mass-based following, that history gets omitted from white liberals. And so it positions entities like the Garland Fund to position the NAACP as like the natural representative of Black people's interests, because it happens to be closer in proximity to it and not our community.
Oh, hold on, Kaba. Hold on. Let me go ahead. Say it again. Hold on.
Yeah, I was say that's a good point, because especially that connection with the NAACP, and then also the integration piece, because it's still the whole push behind integration was again around proximity to whiteness. It was that we couldn't have our own schools given just adequate equal resources. No, we had to be close to them. We had to be bused closer to them. I'm from the South, and my mother's sister, her younger sister, was the first class that was integrated. And it's funny with Brown, because people keep talking about 1954, but a lot of those places didn't get integrated, quote unquote, until like the 70s. And my mother's younger sister was the first class that was integrated into the bigger white school in 1970. That's how long it took. 1970. So 16 years. But I remember her, and every year they still talk about going to her and her classmates. They still have reunions, every so often, and they still count themselves as being graduates of the Black school that they were at. And in many cases, the Black students who were forced to go to the white schools did not want to go to the white schools. They said very explicit. There's a newspaper article in one of the local Black papers that came out a couple of years ago in their 50th anniversary, their 40th anniversary graduation class. And they were all talking about the fact that they did not want to go to the white school. They were perfectly happy at the Black school, and they said they didn't understand why they had to be bused all the way out there when they could have just walked to their Black school. So that point, that's something that resonates with me personally. And then secondly, because my city where I'm from is so white, it's like over 85% white. The integration kind of worked in a different way, because in situations like that, which were not the norm, obviously, the white students some white students ended up having to go to the school that was formerly Black. And that happened in 1972. And when that was announced, all of a sudden the school got bombed. So that's just another little tidbit of information that sometimes gets overlooked.
Wow.
See that again as the failure of white society to make non-violence work.
There it is.
No, but
That's one instance where the toy actually came in handy, brother Dr. Paul. I appreciate you for that.
it's gonna. So I found the line that I was looking for. He when the dude writes back to her, he says, "But I see genius and agency where you see victimhood." He says to her, and she say, you know, which that line particularly bothered me because he's telling the black woman that when you raise the critique that white philanthropy would be designed to redirect black politics into safer directions, you're claiming victimhood. And I really don't like when that language gets turned around. I have a particular pet peeve when people who are victimized claim victimhood, and that's somehow a negative. You know, I think, you know, being a victim is in and of itself is not a negative. So she was just performing an analysis, and then you know, and he comes back with that anyway, anyway, I just wanted to find that line. That was it. I don't really have anything more on that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the, you know, I think part of what that lacks is an analysis of political economy. Like when people don't have money, people are going to find ways to get access to it. And that's a part of, you know, the pernicious nature of capitalism, right? Is understanding that, you know, if you got money, you're going to be able to shift where people go, because Black people, given our circumstance in the United States, don't have it to the extent that we need. And one of the things that I think happens a lot contemporaneously in social movement spaces, and I've had people say versions of this to me, which is like, you know, I'm gonna get their money, I'm gonna feign like I'm gonna do what they want, and then I'm gonna do what I want to do. You know what I mean? And part of the problem is that the work and energy it takes to be in the networks where that money is, the work it takes to pretend, quote unquote, to do what they want you to do, that work takes you away from actually doing the work of building a base, right? And I think one of the things, and this is one of the things I wanted to get to, is that I just feel like because of what I describe as like a doctrinaire, caricaturish critique of capitalism, that particularly, you know, Black left organizations have not sufficiently thought about ways to sustain their organizations. And so the result of that is that people then go to philanthropy, right? And it's almost like this default where people feel like because they're a nonprofit or get money from philanthropy, that makes them less of a capitalist, right? You know, like LBS, we're an organization that's funded by, you know, people that give us money monthly. You know, we also do, you know, like some fee for service stuff, right? You know, we have like a social entrepreneurship model in terms of how we sustain ourselves. And that approach in terms of how we sustain ourselves provides us greater levels of autonomy than those who are reliant straight up on the public sector or on the nonprofit industrial complex. And so I just find that in conversations about like sustainable organizations that can spend the majority of their time like doing Black liberation work, like work to really do the work of building, you know, Black sovereignty, Black self-determination, you know, addressing some of the ways that this society is, you know, in the short and immediate term is doing harm to our community. That and this for me, this is why the Garvey thing was important, right? And you know, there's certainly things to critique about the UNIA, but the UNIA in its approach to anti-lynching was able to move based on what was best for Black people, as opposed to what the Garland Fund wanted them to work on, right? And that's just the reality that, you know, Garvey had an institution that was not funded by philanthropy, and therefore on that particular matter of policy, you know, UNIA was able to have some integrity, right, in terms of how they were able to deal with the anti-lynching issue, as opposed to the NAACP, which, you know, to, you know, Dr. Francis's point, was moved away off of its square because of the need for resources, because of its reliance on white philanthropy.
So this is what I think comes up, even comes into either synchronicity or conflict with my argument around the after party, and around, and well, not even that, but even more broadly around the argument around political versus economic power. That there is no catching up economically before we can move politically. So at some point, it seems to me that people either have to be willing to work with a smaller base of revenue or find alternative income outside of their organizational work, or they will likely become professional activists bought off by an establishment that leads them ever to the right. So my point, without, like, for instance, staying with LBS more so than the UNIA, and not being at all in your bank accounts and pockets, my assumption would then be that you all would have to be willing on principle to exist, to live off of less money, to work with less money, and to work with different levels of fame and elite political access in order to do the work that you're doing. And the point, I think, has to be in broader support of that work is that more of us have to be willing to volunteer our time as activists and organizers, and to provide what is our only real power, which is numbers. That's all that we have, is numbers.
So I would say two things to that.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So one is, I think you and I are in agreement in terms of the importance of politics. We're not going to catch up. So getting our quote unquote money right is not going to get us to the place where we actually can have real power in the society and protect ourselves from, racist, white supremacist, colonialist attack on our humanity. So that I feel clear about, and I think we're in agreement on. I think, and so the second part in terms of, having to take less money, having to get, less access to elite circles, I think that is true. But I do think that when we think about building organization, like, I think we have to be able to imagine a business model that makes it so that people don't have to be broke and do the work. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the point where, because I think sometimes I see people make being broke and an activist a virtue. And that's just not an effective way to do the work. And it's a part of, for those of us who consider ourselves, revolutionary, committed to Black liberation, much of the scholarship and the stuff we read and talk about doesn't get us to that place. Like, it doesn't talk about like a business model, right? Because I think sometimes people feel icky about even the notion of a business model, you know what I'm saying? Because you see yourself as, as a leftist. But to me, it's like everybody has a business model. They just don't call it that, right? If you work at a nonprofit, that's a business model, right? If you work at a separate job or do you work on the side, that's a business model. And so the question is, what is your relationship to the capital that sustains you, right? And so I think organizations that are doing political work, because there are different kinds of work that are important that aren't necessarily political per se. But if you see yourselves doing political work, you need a business model such that, folks in power can't make phone calls to take away your resources. But you also need to have a business model that allows you enough resources to be able to actually substantively do the work. You know what I'm saying? And have a business model, which again, I'm very proud of, for which the basis of LBS's ability to make money is based on our ability to deliver results to Black people, right? So it's not based on whether certain funders like us, right? It's not based on whether we get on television or not. It's based on a community of folks that say their work, we see their work, we feel the benefits of their work. And so I think that is the conversation that, unfortunately, in a lot of the meetings that I've been in or conversations I've been in, I just haven't heard enough fleshing out of what it would take to actually build an organization that, again, isn't balling, like isn't rich, you know what I'm saying, but actually has the resources it needs to like really get it done.
But see, that's what I'm saying. I don't think that there is a business model for that. There is a business model to sustain a core group of people who are permanently ensconced in organizational work to live and obviously not suffer materially, but they can't be buying $1 million homes, and they can't be living in elite apartments and downtown lofts and all this other kind of stuff either. because because I don't think there is a business model that is sustainable, and there's nothing that protects against if a group or movement reaches a certain point that we would hope it would reach, that those in power wouldn't be able to shut off the resources anyway. I mean, there's no business model free from resources being cut off by the state when they really want to get to it. So that's why I'm saying, like, we need this part. I don't know exactly how to do, obviously, but the point I think has to be the focus needs to be encouraging people to, in addition to whatever they're doing to survive on a daily basis, to put in some service to some sort of, on some level, to some organization or struggle. So my point initially is in terms of the after party point, for instance, is that this is just an issue of voting. So it's not a matter of, you don't have to, there's no other sort of material risk or need for fundraising to make a politically educated choice to vote for someone you yourself have played a role in vetting the platform of and candidacy of. So for instance, just as an example, or supporting promoting the work of the organizations that are doing what we need done, doesn't necessarily require tremendous amounts of money or time necessarily for everybody. It requires certain levels of political education and commitment and agreement in terms of certain base matter levels of behavior. But I think what without starting from the sort of anchor point I'm advocating, it's too easy to go into the directions we're talking about here. I mean, how much money is needed for how many organizations to do what? Like, for instance, and I'll stop here, but part of this is age, part of this is politics, part of this is whatever in my relationship to the struggle at this point. But as I was reading that Campaign Zero article, other than some vague references here or there, I hadn't heard or felt the impact of or seen any of the whatever they've supposed to have been doing all these years, making all this money with all this attention from all these superstars and political fame, whatever. So I'm saying, I'm like, and yet the kind of work I'm talking about that I would like to see happening, the direct action, the strikes, the shutting of things down, that doesn't require funding per se, as much as it requires just certain levels of commitment from an organized, group of people. But anyway, let me stop. Go ahead.
Yeah. So real quick, and I do got to bounce, but real quick, and it probably calls for a part two. I think the things you name do require resources. It's a question, and I do think it does. Some of it is about commitment. Like, a lot of it is about commitment. It doesn't require resources. The idea of having individual people in the community fund a movement is a business model, right? And so that's what I mean when I say business model. I'm not necessarily talking about like big corporation. You know what I mean? I'm talking about like if funding an organization means building a system where the community is funding the movements that represent it, that's a business model. So the question becomes, how do you operationalize it? Like, how do you make it happen? And again, we were fortunate enough to find like some technology, right, that helps us to be able to do that. We have, an approach to how we promote the work that we do that allows us to do that. So that, we're an organization where there are over 600 people that give us money monthly to do our work, right? And, 90% of those folks are folks in Baltimore City, right? So, you know what I mean? So it's like, when I say business model, like having discussions about how do we build these approaches to sustaining the work that, again, is accountable to the community. So that's what I mean when I say business model, to be able to have the resources to effectively do the things that you describe. You know what I mean? But again, I do got to bounce, man.
No, that's cool. I'm going to say one more thing in your absence about this article and what she says about code switching. But there's many more parts to this, man. So anytime, you're welcome back, man. Appreciate you, man.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you.
All right. Take care.
All right. Peace.
All right, everybody. Big thanks to Dayvon. Brother Kaba is working his way back, and we're endeavoring to figure out where our next guests are. But in the interim, there was one other piece, because I did want to come back to this article for this one part in it, because in this exchange, and it's fascinating, where Dr. Francis essentially is telling Professor Witt, in a very polite and professional way, you don't know how to hear Black people and read Black history. So she says here, I also try to think through what code switching sounded like in the late 1920s. And by that, I mean how Black people change what they say and how they talk when white people are around, and or when they think white people are listening. I did this in an effort to begin to address Du Bois's theory of double consciousness, in which he explained the sense of looking at oneself through the eyes of the others, and that Blacks constantly have to think about how they are perceived by non-Blacks. If we believe Du Bois, then how might we incorporate his double consciousness theoretical framework into our archival analysis of this period? How does it disrupt and challenge how we traditionally read archives? I really like what she does here, and I'm sure she's not the first. I'm sure I've seen other examples of it or whatever, or maybe or whatever. I don't remember, but I just think this is dope. Myself and the majority of Black people I know code switch today. So surely the NAACP's Black leaders practiced some variation of code switching in this earlier period when they interacted with white funders. This does not mean that I did not take everything at face value in the archives, but for my analysis, it meant that in situations that directly involved the Garland Fund, that I probe deeper the words that were written or stated out loud. I think that's brilliant and perfect analysis, or methodology rather, to bring to research. So I love that she did that. So the example, right. So one example that I would like to highlight revolves around how to interpret Walter Wright White's response to Morris Ernst, whom I argue is leading the education charge of the Garland Fund. I know most watching this already know, but Walter White was at the time, the Black head of the NAACP, and Morris Ernst, the white delegate, I guess, from the Garland Fund. When pressed by Johnson, now who is Johnson? I forgot what the Johnson is here. But anyway, when pressed by Johnson why he has not written Ernst back, White responds, "At last here is the memorandum drafted along the lines which you suggested. This is only a rough draft. This is only a rough copy for you, Lewis, and Jim to use as a basis. I have no pride of authorship, so don't hesitate to speak frankly about it. Read on its own, it's a bit innocuous, but when read in consideration of the power dynamics at play and in context with the rest of White's correspondence over the previous decade, most of which is rapid and detailed, it is clear that he is signaling his disapproval with the process by declaring he has no pride of authorship. In many ways, White embodies the frustration of Black voices in a Jim Crow racial order in which their perspectives are only made visible when they comported with white notions of rights making. This brief explanation of my historical methodology is perhaps partly responsible for our divergences on two key aspects of the narrative." Anyway, so I thought that was what she does there is brilliant. I encourage everybody to read this article for the more complex details and nuances, etc. But not only is she helping us understand today, that is Dr. Francis helping us understand today the limitations of white philanthropic involvement, nonprofit involvement in Black political struggle, but she's showing in this particular instance, in the exchange with her colleague, the shortcomings of even a white liberal analysis of Black history, saying your historical methodology is making you miss key points being made and said there. I just think it's fascinating. It's fascinating. So anyway, I encourage everybody to check it out. Brother Kaba is back. Our next guest, Dr. James Nadell, if I'm saying that correctly, if not, he'll correct me, is waiting in the wings himself. So we are going to move on here very quickly after this very, very, very quick break. So don't go anywhere. Much more coming up here on our Mix What I Like at BPM. Don't move.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.